Has a problem with alcohol, drugs, codependency, or eating disorders, we'd like to hear from you. Here's the phone number, 303-457-9952. If your call is long distance, let it ring, and we'll answer when we can put you on the air. Jann will be taking your calls in just a moment at 303-457-9952.
Good evening, everyone. This is Jan Scott. Welcome to the Friday night edition of Addiction Free Radio. Let's see. Tonight, in about 3 minutes, we're going to We're going to have Terry Kellogg, a tape of his on. He'll be talking about codependency. Very funny guy. I'll introduce him in just a minute. We're also going to talk here briefly about what's going on in the latest addiction news. Looks like everybody's killing one another on the streets of Denver in these past few days over cocaine, crack. Cocaine's the 7th biggest business in the United States, right next to Ford Motor Company. 7th biggest corporation in the United States is cocaine. 7th biggest business. Pretty amazing. No wonder people are killing each other for this stuff on the streets. According to the Daily Camera, according to the Rocky Mountain News, 2 ex-Aspenites are indicted in a drug ring, a $90 million operation. And these guys are baby boomers. Roy Key and George Cashing, 41 and 40. Busted big time. 100,000 pounds of marijuana on one boat coming in from Jamaica. You should know better. Well, the Pentagon is now going to throw $300 million at surveillance equipment and military equipment to help catch drug smugglers. $300 million. This was passed in the Senate the other day. We are stepping up the war on drugs. Will we win? Stay tuned. Here's something kind of interesting, actually very useful that's happened. Board of Education, the State Department of Health, Tom Vernon, has gotten our legislature and the State Board of Education to pass a resolution urging local school districts to snuff out student smoking. Way to go, Tom! Finally, he's starting to do what we pay him to do. That's good. Good stuff. Now here's something. Sugar is addictive. Now some people will disagree with me on that. I happen to have studied the effects of sugar for a long time, and I certainly know as much about it as anybody. And one thing that you need to know about sugar is that it is highly addictive. It's just as addictive as caffeine or nicotine or dope, and it's very destructive. And again, according to the Rocky Mountain News, they've put out a little story here that says, these are some of the ways to find out if you're ingesting sugar into your body, and if any packages have these names on them, you are taking sugar. Even though a lot of companies lie about it. They'll say it's sugar-free, but it has this stuff in it. They're lying. And you need to watch it if you're concerned about your addiction to sugar. So the following might as well be called white sugar, because when it processes down, it's sugar, okay? Dextrose, lactose, sorbitol, glucose, sucrose, mannitol, fructose. It goes on forever, including corn sweeteners, honey, and molasses. That's enough of the news. Oh, Coors. They're spending 30% more this year on advertising. Their beer sales started to fall. They pumped it up. They raised their beer sales. Now, of course, beer isn't a drug. We all know that, right? Terry Kellogg. We're going to listen to some of what he has to say about codependency. Very brilliant guy, one of the foremost experts on codependency, and he will be speaking at the Centennial Peaks Hospital in Boulder. tomorrow night. So without further ado, we are going to jump right into it and let Terry Kellogg speak for himself. 457-9952. If you want to put your 2 cents worth in, you can do it at the first break at quarter after. So it's 457-9952. If we get calls here, we'll put you on if you have this kind of stuff going on with you. Here's Terry Kellogg.
I used to talk about codependency as a sort of a Minnesota phenomena, Minnesota illness. And we discovered it up there, but I always used to like to say, well, you know, I have so much shame about it coming from Minnesota and me coming from Minnesota. I sort of feel like Californians with the California flu virus and stuff. And so I always like to say that in Minnesota it's all a mistake. It was cold dependency. It's with an L. So I've been working in the field for about 15 years, and I realized that I got into the field because of my codependency. I think I'm finally looking at staying in the field because of it's something that I decided to do. When I realized that, and I did leave the field for a while just so I could make it my own decision. I got enmeshed in a lot of family system stuff and began to take care of people in my family and continued that for the rest of my life. And so I did take about an 8-month vacation. It was kind of nice, but I got back in. Seeing you all here actually reminds me of a little cartoon that Mary saw and told me about. She said she saw a cartoon. There was this room, and there was a sign, and it said heaven, and it had an arrow pointing to heaven. And there was this other sign that said, lecture on heaven, and an arrow pointing to the lecture on heaven, and all the adult children of alcoholics were lined up for the lecture on heaven. Well, codependency is considered an addiction now, maybe not by the American Medical Association, but at least by all of us. And a definition of addiction is that it's a pathological relationship with any mood-altering event, experience, or thing that causes major life problems. So we see addictions in terms of relationships that are dysfunctional. So I guess a definition of codependency would be that it's a pathological relationship with pathological relationships. So I sort of like that definition. Actually, I was going to call this talk Codependency as a Country Western Phenomena. And I was going to tell you that you could have all saved $20 by just staying home and turning on Kick. You know, if you really look at some of the titles of songs, so what are some of the songs that you can think of that are codependency? Stand By Your Man? Yeah. Anything else? Anybody got it? I Can't Go On Without You? Okay. Yeah, a good-hearted woman with a mean, good time in man. All right, great. My wife hates country western music. Pardon? I'm addicted to you, baby. All right, it really is. It has it all there. So you could have stayed home and listened to KIKK. You know, he's no good, but I love him anyway. I'm nothing without her. You know, it goes both ways. It's not just, you know, women who are codependent. How about the old song, Fairy Tales Can Come True, It Can Happen to You? And look at what fairy tales are about. You know, aren't they usually about being rescued by a handsome prince? You know, however, there's a prerequisite. You got to kiss a lot of toads and frogs before you get there. You know, I was thinking of Cinderella, of low self-esteem. She meets Mr. Wonderful, and they go away to live happily ever after with his mother. You know, we're not the only codependent culture, though, around. If you think about it, 80% of the poems written in the Romantic era were written to dead virgins. Really, go through your poetry. What? What? Lost love, broken hearts. You know, actually, codependency is the only pathology I know of that doesn't even have its own name. Think about that. You know, in fact, the very name is sort of ambiguous. It's tenuous. What does it mean? Codependency? You know, how can you be dependent on codes? Or what are codes anyway? And you think of like food addiction, right? You got something substantial, something you put your teeth into, so to speak. You think of chemical dependency. You know, that's substantial. But this codependency, see, and I think that the disease is about as nebulous and ambiguous as its name. So it really is fitting. What I want to do today is explore some of what it is, where it comes from, how it affects others, and how it affects self. And notice the order that I put that in. See, one of the things, one of the first questions that we often ask as codependents is, what am I doing to everybody around me? And one of the first things we're going to talk about is what we're doing to ourselves as codependents. And that's part of the recovery, starting to look at self first, obviously. I've been working so hard on this lecture and worried so much about it, I began to realize just how codependent I was. I mean, I've been up till 3 o'clock in the morning writing this thing out, right? So I'll get it just right, and that you'll be satisfied, and that you'll still like me. And part of that is just being a third kid. The original literature about codependency, even before it had its own name, really came out of alcoholism. It really came out of the field and the study of alcoholism. And that's why it came from Minnesota, because in Minnesota, you know, our treatment of alcoholism, well, you know, I always talk about how we have more treatment centers than Dairy Queens. And the reason we have that is because of the weather. That's really true. I mean, there's not much to do in the winter but go to treatment. No, actually, it is because of the weather, but it's because we were the third state to get AA. And it happened after Ohio State-Minnesota football game. And Ohio had AA before us, but some of the people came there, and they got snowed in, so they invited Minnesotans into their meeting, and they started AA in Minnesota. So it was a real early state. But the weather problem, the other part of it is that alcoholics don't do well during the winter in Minnesota if they don't have a home or a family, if they've lost their enabling system. And so if they're on the streets, you know, we used to have to collect them and put them in state hospitals just to keep them warm until spring. And so what they did was they brought the AA program into the state hospitals, and that was the beginnings of treatment. Now, the treatment concept expanded to include alcoholics with families. You know, and what happened is it was like, as Mary was talking about earlier, we get a population of people together for a long enough time where we really start to notice what's going on, not just with them, but with their families. And so we noticed that the families were really sick, and that sometimes the spouse looked sicker than the alcoholic and had more problems and all the earmarks and symptoms of the disease. And so we started to look at that person as the co-addict, in other words. Actually, the term codependency didn't come up until we got to the term chemical dependency, you know, because we realized it wasn't just alcoholism, it was an addiction to chemicals. And it really isn't an addiction to chemicals, it's an addiction to the high that chemicals give you. But we started using the term the co-addict, you know, to describe that person whose life is revolving around the codependent. I believe that you can define codependency, and I'm going to try to do that. But every time you define something, you sort of put it in a box. And more, you know, the alcoholism literature is showing that there isn't alcoholism, there's alcoholisms, that every person has the disease a bit differently. That's even more true for codependency. There isn't codependency, there's codependencies. So someone else will tell their story about their codependency, and you can't relate to a bit of it, so you say, thank God I'm not codependent. You know, and then you spend the next week trying to help that person. And we've gone from the alcoholism concept of codependency, which is where we discovered it, to the idea that maybe you can be codependent in other kinds of systems besides
457-9952.
require alcoholism. So now we're looking at maybe that you could be codependent on anybody with a set of needs that you're trying to fill yourself. And so that's not just alcohol. A sex addict has that. A person with a physical illness has that, as well as any other kind of addiction. A gambler has that. A food addict has that. A person with a mental illness has that. You know, and so a person with a, some kind of a chronic or ongoing physical illness, or a periodic, occasional, sporadic physical illness. A person who just feels empty has that. Who never reached adulthood, who's gotten stuck in their child dependency needs, has a lot of needs. And so I think the codependent system is just built around a person with needs and a person who is trying to take care of those needs.
Addiction-free radio.
Well, I'm 34 years old. I was married for 7 years, and I started dating right after I got divorced. I was putting personal ads in the paper, and every girl I went out with in the last 2 years has been either a drug addict or an alcoholic.
Addiction-free radio is in direct contact with a radio audience reaching out for help.
I was really depressed and upset and feeling like it's just futile, and why don't I just sit in my car and freeze myself to death? And I know that's not the solution.
Each week, Jann Scott hosts Addiction-Free Radio, a one-of-a-kind telephone call-in program that offers listeners a wide range of recovery-oriented information.
Hi, everyone. This is Jann Scott. Welcome to the 6th edition of Addiction Free Radio. Our show broadcasts up and down the Front Range, and we talk about addiction, alcoholism, codependency, drug addiction, eating disorders. We've had some guests on earlier with eating disorders. We talk about the 12 steps. We talk about adult children of alcoholics or adult children of addicts. We talk about dysfunctional families on this program, compulsive spending, relationship addiction. We talk about recovery.
One way Addiction Free Radio spreads the hope of recovery is through a wide range of informed guests.
Well, we talk about the insanity of the disease. You know, like you said, we're sure we don't have it. It's the only disease. You know, if you have cancer, you know you have cancer. You admit you have cancer. If you're an alcoholic, you'll deny it right to the grave.
I started to recover when my life didn't work anymore, when it just quit.
I went to treatment and met a bunch of really wonderful people who told me I never had to use drugs or alcohol again.
Addiction Free Radio, reaching out to those who need it most.
I just thank God this radio program is on the air.
Hi, this is Jann Scott. If you'd like to talk with me more about Addiction Free Radio, call me at area code 303-449-5424.
Addiction Free Radio. You can talk with Jann in just a moment at area code 303-457-9952. If you're calling long distance, let the phone ring. We'll answer just as soon as we can put you on the air. Addiction Free Radio is the only regularly scheduled talk show on the globe that we know of, broadcasting information for those suffering from an addiction. Jann will be back to answer your questions in just a moment. We are now taking phone calls at area code 303-457-9952. Jann will be back in just 2 minutes.
Honey, where's your paycheck? I need to pay the bills. Honey? Tom, you got paid today, didn't you?
Yeah, but there's no money left.
No money left? Again? The kids need new shoes, and what about the house payment? Tom, you've been drinking again, haven't you? Or is it cocaine this time? You promised me that you'd quit. You said you could do it on your own, that you didn't need any help. There's just no hope.
Don't give up. There is hope at Family Recovery Center. Family Recovery Center is the only hospital-based drug, alcohol, and codependency treatment facility in northern Colorado. Our specially trained and caring people will give you the help you've been hoping for. Call Family Recovery Center 24 hours a day, toll-free, at 1-800-322-HOPE. That's 1-800-322-4673. Let Family Recovery Center help you and your family live a life free from alcohol and other drugs.
Okay, we're back here live on Addiction Free Radio. We're going to go right straight back to Terry Kellogg.
Definitions of codependency, it's often described or defined as an addiction to destructive relationship. And in that sense, you know, there's a recursiveness about codependent patterns in our life. The codependency is mood altering. I mean, it's not like euphoria, but it really is that we distract ourselves from our feelings. You know, codependency is not like banana cream pie or cocaine. You don't just get this big euphoric lift off of it, but we get to distract ourselves from our feelings. We don't have to deal with our feelings as long as we're in a codependent relationship or relationships. And the other thing is that some people are codependent in certain areas of their life and not in others. And codependents are generally very functional people in so many areas, but the pathology kind of exhibits itself here and there. It's also life destructive. So it really does fit that pattern of addiction, you know, causing major life consequences. Codependents have a very hard time taking care of themselves. You know, it's sort of the bottom line of it. Another kind of definition would be it's a pattern of adaptive behaviors. Codependents have learned a pattern of behaviors to adapt to situations that they're in. In other words, we don't sort of take charge of the situation or get out of the situation, we adapt to it. And that's one of the strengths of codependency. In fact, codependency I see it more in terms of survival than even disease. Because codependents have used their codependency to survive a long, long time, all of their lives, in fact. Another way of looking at it is this is an overreaction to outside of self and an underreaction to internal self. It's like we're always checking out if we're okay, or we let other people's behavior and other people's ideas about us determine who we are. Gretchen says it like this. She says, you know, it seems like if someone around me steals a car, I always go to jail. You know, and that's really sort of a codependent's life, is that, you know, they're always going to jail for someone else's crime. Another way of defining it is that it's an undifferentiated identity, that we can't really tell the difference between ourselves and others. It's like we don't know where we stop and they begin. It's sort of, we're just undifferentiated from other people's roles and responsibilities and who they are and what they think and what they feel. It's a way of defining self through others. You know, we're really confused about if we're okay, and we don't even know who gets to vote. We feel empty. Codependency is basically an emptiness of self. And it's not that we are empty, it's that we feel empty. And there's an important distinction. You know, everybody's empty. There's this existential emptiness or aloneness that we all have. But for codependents, it's not just that they are, it's just that they always feel it. It's like their life is controlled by that feeling of emptiness. And they're trying to fill the void with another person. And trying to fill that void with another person is like putting 2 feet in one shoe. And it's even hard to walk around that way if you've ever seen someone do it. We also tend to self-judge through shame. I really think that the flawed feeling that shame is, the self-hate, becomes sort of the codependent's armor or the codependent's shield. And it's our lens as well. It's how we see ourselves. We see ourselves often through our own self-hate. I think shame is a key ingredient to codependency, as I think is guilt. Guilt is, I believe, the veneer of codependency if shame is the armor. It's like right underneath the armor there's this guilt that we don't have the right to be ourselves, to be unique. Basically, it's a painful external validation pattern, that we're looking for validation through other people. It always comes from outside of ourselves. In other words, if people ask us who we are, we immediately respond with the question, who do you want me to be? And we try to, you know, live up to that billing. In terms of how we see life, I think we see life more as a problem to be solved, or at least a series of problems to be solved. And that the more codependent you become, the bigger the problems seem, and they start to control you. And of course, I've talked about how in the chronic stages of codependency, we start to get phobias. And we start to have fear because we're controlling so much, and we're dealing with so many problems that the problems begin to feel overwhelming. And it really is a scary illness. Then when you know, because of all the problems, it's a fearful thing every morning to have to face those problems. And as the problems escalate, I think our fear of breaking down escalates, which is basically what a phobia is. A phobia isn't just a fear, it's a fear of a panic attack. You know, and so I believe that a lot of the codependent fears that we talk about, people that have been married to alcoholics, I noticed, you know, before I even knew what codependency was, I noticed that there's a pattern of fears stopping driving, you know, or maybe not driving on freeways, or not driving at night, or not driving, you know, in the winter, fear of storms, fear of agoraphobics. Percentage of agoraphobics that either come from alcoholic families or are married to alcoholic families is extreme. It's between like 60 and 80% of the ones that we've worked with in our clinic. You know, and so, you know, it's like those fears begin to control us. And that comes from seeing life as a problem to be solved, rather than a mystery to be embraced, or at least a process to be lived out. I know that one of the first things I believe codependents let go of is downhill skiing. As a codependent, you know, that's something that I find myself not doing very much. And if you really look at the problem with downhill skiing, well, in Texas it's a bigger problem, but you know, codependents would try it anyway in Texas. If it's hard, we'll just try harder. However, the downhill skiing, if you really look at downhill skiing, it's like a problem. First of all, you got to get there. You know, it's a long ways off. Then the weather, you know, it usually has to be winter or cold and sometimes stormy and snowy. And then the equipment, you know, if God had meant us to downhill ski, would have given us breakaway ankles, right? So you know, you got to check your equipment and have the right equipment, and then of course you're supposed to look right, and get there. And then there's always the lines because everybody else decided that day to go skiing as well in the whole world. And so I started to just look at all those problems, and then every once in a while, though, I kind of surmount the problems. I go downhill skiing, I say, why didn't I do this more often? But I don't do it more often simply because the codependent sort of aspects of my life have me looking too much at the problems. And so I give it up. I don't do those things that require preparation and time and energy and all that stuff. I think we also start to see ourselves as martyrs or victims or saints. We start to define ourselves, and sometimes all of the above. We can feel like martyrs. We can kind of, cognitively be thinking about how we're always victimized, but be convinced that we're on our way to sanctity. As a matter of fact, that's how most of the saints got there, I think, if you really look at it. Most of them were martyred. And that's the quickest way to get there, but, but codependency is such a slow martyrdom. A lot of times we attempt perfection. But I believe that anything that you say about any pathology, 180 degrees is also going to be true. 180 degrees from sick is still sick. So we not just attempt perfection, but we're always giving up. See, and so we'll attempt perfection, and then we can't make it, and then we give up. And then we attempt it again. And it's a cycle of perfection and giving up. We view ourselves as caretakers and rescuers and professional helpers or amateur helpers. In fact, the professional field is literally filled with codependency. In fact, I have an easier time talking to professionals about codependency than the public because I know everybody there, has some issues with it. As a matter of fact, I always like to notice how many ambulances are parked in the parking lot as I walk into a lecture on codependency. It's like we tend to drive our ambulances through life and kind of pick people up and carry them around for as long as they need to. Actually, it's not even an ambulance, it's a hospital on wheels because we don't like to refer them and let go of them either. One of the things that we tend to do also is we view enmeshment as intimacy. We view enmeshment as intimacy. I'm going to get to enmeshment later on today. But viewing enmeshment as intimacy, one of the problems with codependency is that we don't, we're undifferentiated, so we don't have ego boundaries. And without ego boundaries, you can't really have relationship. You just get enmeshed. But that's the closest we can get to intimacy, and so we're willing to settle for it because when we get disenmeshed, all we have is isolation, and isolation without ego boundaries is really tough as well. And in the codependent family system, no one has ego boundaries, so there's really no one real enough to get close to. You have to be real and around real people to get close. And if it's undifferentiated, there is no real closeness, there's no intimacy, and so you substitute that for enmeshment. I think, in fact, that codependency is difficult to treat because the problem serves a purpose. Another way of looking at it is that, like a lot of us have these children, in fact, are defined by our parents, right? And we depend on that relationship with them for who we are, and we get worth through our parents as children, but a lot of us didn't get that. So we have this hole, and we try to fill this hole. And so some of us are trying to fill it with banana cream pie. Some of us are kind of trying to fill it through our nose with cocaine. And some of us are trying to fill it with gambling. We're trying to fill it with something. But it's not a banana cream pie hole. It's not a money hole. And so it really is a people hole. It's like we didn't get what we wanted with our dependency needs on our parents. We didn't get those met in healthy ways. I think that codependents come the closest to knowing what the hole is about, that it's a people hole, right? Because codependents are trying to fill it with people and relationship. And that's one of the neat things about codependency. However, if you don't have yourself and you don't have ego boundaries, that enmeshed relationship, you're filling it with destructive relationship and caretaking relationships and enmeshed relationships, and that doesn't really work any better than filling it with money, drugs, or banana cream pie. Incidentally, I did a lecture yesterday and they served pie. It came just as I went to the podium, and so I missed it. So if I mention pie a lot, it's...
Addiction-free radio. You can talk with Jann in just a moment at area code 303-457-9952. If you're calling long distance, let the phone ring. We'll answer just as soon as we can put you on the air. Addiction-free radio is the only regularly scheduled talk show on the globe that we know of, broadcasting information for those suffering from an addiction. Jann will be back to answer your questions in just a moment. We are now taking phone calls at area code 457-9952. Jan will be back in just 2 minutes.
There was no me in our relationship. Everything was him. To him, with him, because of him. I was afraid of saying no, especially when he drank or used drugs. I didn't want to lose him, so I just gave in. Somewhere along the way, I lost me, and now I feel so depressed.
I loved her so much, I'd do anything to keep her happy, to keep her needing me. I sacrificed what was important to me just for her. She resented me, said I was trying to control her. My solution? Try to be even nicer and more helpful, but it didn't work.
Codependency not only affects people emotionally involved with an alcoholic or drug addict, but also those individuals without chemical abuse problems in the family, but who have placed their needs secondary to the needs and wants of others. Family Recovery Center in Greeley is a drug, alcohol, and codependency treatment facility. Call Family Recovery Center 24 hours a day, toll-free at 1-800-322-HOPE. That's 1-800-322-4673.
Let the world know how proud you are of your team, business, or club on a beautiful t-shirt or sweatshirt from the Letterhead. T-shirts for fun and games from the Letterhead at 449-1727. We know you're in a hurry and that you needed it yesterday. That's why we're in business. Call Preferred Printing at 444-3244. That's Preferred Printing, 444-3244. Right now, I'd like to tell you about Indy Honda. They specialize in servicing and repairing.
And permissiveness isn't building boundaries. There's got to be something in the middle there where you just notice how people set limits. You know, that people will maybe lock the bathroom, you know, when they're sitting on the pot. You know, and that's just a limit. That way people don't have to be exposed to you sitting on the pot. You know, and if you learn that, and some families don't have that sense, you know, you know, when you're in bed with each other, you have the door closed and people respect that. You set the limit. You know, they don't walk on you, in on you making love. And they don't walk in your closet and grab all your clothes because, you know, that's a limit. And when they see you setting limits, then they learn to have limits themselves. And it's from our limits that we build boundaries. And I think boundaries are a key for codependency recovery, and codependents tend not to have boundaries. And that's what produces the enmeshment. And the other thing is that boundaries, as they're built, are internal. You can't build external boundaries, but the limits are external that produce the internal boundaries. And I think a lot of people are trying to build their boundaries as external, and it doesn't work. They become walls then, and people can't get close. And that's the isolation part when we deal with the enmeshment. There's also cycles to our codependency in our relationships. I think that if you really don't have a sense of interdependency, which is the ideal, right? That you can depend on people and depend on you, and they can depend on you and themselves, and you're going to be around people that do that. See, that's interdependency. But I think that what we have is we have like an independency, codependency swing when you don't have interdependency. In other words, in my relationship, you know, I have a need for closeness. So I get close to Gretchen, and then I get enmeshed. And that means that I'm more concerned about what she's feeling than what I'm feeling. You know, except it does feel kind of good for a while to be close, but eventually I start to, you know, it's like second guess her, start to tell her what she's thinking and what she's feeling, and start to react and respond, and I start to lose more and more of myself, and I get stuck. And this is how I get when I'm close to Gretchen. And it feels horrible after a while. But it's like the Chinese finger puzzle. The harder you pull, the tighter you're in, right? It's really hard to break from it. But every once in a while, you know, the way to do it is to get a scissors and snip the little bugger, right? That's what a lot of us do. You know, we snip it. You know, rather than, if you got a Chinese finger puzzle, the way to get out of it is to just relax, right? And then, you know, then you're out. But the fact is that we struggle or snip. Now, I snip, and then I'm isolated, and that's my independence, and it feels great now. Boy, I don't have to worry about anybody else's feelings but my own, and on and on. You know, but the fact is that I'm starting to gain weight again. I'm starting to smoke more, drink more, obsessed, not take it. You know, so I got to go back in here and get enmeshed. And that's the relationship cycle. We get a fear of the distance, so we get close, and then we get enmeshed and can't stand the smothering, so we get distant. And we keep going back and forth like that. And what codependents really need to learn is a whole new line. And that line is a very simple line of detachment and intimacy. But you can't have intimacy until you have yourself. You see, you have to be whole and have these limits and boundaries. And then when you get into a relationship, there's no, you know, you just kind of get close. And when you're on that line of intimacy, wherever you go, so you have both. You have the detachment and intimacy anywhere on the line. I work with a lot of people that travel, and I travel, and I notice that sometimes I start to go crazy when I travel. You know, I want to act out, drink, be crazy, whatever it is. And it's really because of the isolation. As a codependent, when I'm not around my codependent system, I have nothing. I'm not me. I'm empty. And so I try to fill myself with anything. The first thing is turn the TV on. You know, it doesn't matter what's on, even if it's just the snow. You know, just have the TV on. You know, because I can't handle the being with self. And what I found is that as people begin their recovery program for codependency that travel, they actually feel the intimacy of their relationships even when they're gone, even when they're not with right next to the relationship. There's another thing I just want to mention quickly, and that is that there's for some of us we have organizational codependency. And organizational codependency, there's several types. One is that we get in systems where, you know, everybody's enmeshed with each other's reality, and you know, everybody's either has to be or pretend to be best friends, and there's no professional detachment. You know, and that can drive you crazy too, because then all the shame rules and all the codependent, you know, enmeshment occurs, and then our work isn't even a place then that we can get away from it. And I think that a lot of us have that with, you know, with work, especially being in work with, you know, in like all family members around your workplace, and hiring a lot of family members, and working for family and working for in-laws. Now, I'm not saying everybody that's doing that quit your jobs or fire everybody, but I'm just saying that to be recognized that that is a problem, and that is a place where the codependency can begin to escalate then, and the codependency issues in your life, and it becomes more difficult to take care of yourself when you don't have that kind of detachment. And Mary and I were talking about, you know, like sometimes we just get into hanging around with recovering people, and we kind of even get enmeshed in codependent, and that there is a time to just, you know, like hang around with people that have never heard of codependency, or adult children of alcoholics, or whatever. You know, so there is that time. As a matter of fact, I was talking to someone about ACA, and they thought it was that, what, Acapulco Joe or something like that? Yeah, it makes those shirts. You know, that was real refreshing. You know? And speaking of organizational codependency, John Bradshaw, and Nancy, and Mary Bell and I went to dinner last night, of course. I mean, so, we're not friends, though. And we were just kind of talking about codependency, and one, you know, and Mary reminded me of my first definition of how you know you're codependent. I think some of you have heard that. But the real test for codependency is if you're drowning and someone else's life flashes before your eyes. Some of you have been through our clinic, the 5-day clinic, and you know the process where we embrace our feelings and then we have this sign, and it works. But I had a therapist who worked for me. When he went through the clinic, he was so codependent that he had someone else's sign. So, now if you've been through the clinic, you understand that one. Maybe not. Actually, I was in Minneapolis doing a clinic around Halloween at a place, and we were in, you know, right outside the dining room. They had the scarecrow. It was a straw scarecrow, you know, right outside the door. And for 5.5 days, every time I walked through that door, I smiled at that thing. You know, I mean, it's like, oh, you know, I started to say hi. You know. And I always felt bad when it didn't respond, even though I knew it was a scarecrow. I felt rejected and, you know, kind of down for the rest of the day. Mary's been watching, what is it, CNN? Is that the, you know, where they've been having the hearings on the NASA? I'm not going to tell you any NASA jokes, although don't panic about your kids saying all these NASA jokes. That's really a part of gallows humor. And one of the things that codependents need to develop is a sense of humor. It's really a recovery issue to develop a sense of humor, and it's the way that society debriefs from tragedy, is to start making jokes about stuff. And so the NASA jokes are just a cultural debriefing from the tragedy. And as codependents, we really need to develop the sense of humor. As a matter of fact, you don't hear very many codependency jokes, and they're not very popular when they're told. And so, you know, I mean, part of it's developing a sense of humor. But anyway, Mary heard the term blow-by, and she just knew that was a therapeutic term somehow, you know. And so, of course, she asked me what it meant, and I had never heard of it before, but I figured it meant what codependents do with feedback. Does that make sense? And so we went on from there to develop blow-through instead of by, and that's probably what codependents do with feedback that makes sense. You know, we just let it go through us. And because, again, it's like we're trying to let go of the illusion of intimacy. And boy, that's like being on a high wire, you know, and you're kind of balancing up there, but you want to keep balancing Because if you go, you don't know if there's a safety net. You don't know if there's anything else than what you got. So I consider a codependent decision to begin recovery as like a leap of faith. It's like jumping off a high wire and just kind of trusting that there'll be something else for you. Because if all of our relationships are codependent, or if there's a codependent core to our primary relationship, that is kind of all we've got a lot of times, especially in severe, like chronic and acute codependency. That's all we've got. And so it is hard to recover. And even though I joke about it, I mean, I know my codependency has affected me a great deal. It affected my family, and now I'm looking at Gretchen's family. In fact, I started that, really. And I noticed that she has a brother that finishes everybody's sentences. You ever notice that? The last word of every sentence, he starts. But then I looked at my own brother, and I have a brother that starts everybody's sentences. As a matter of fact, no one in my family of origins has ever asked anybody for anything. No one has ever asked anybody for anything. They say, "Is there any ketchup?" Or "I'm thirsty," or "It's cold in here," or "My car needs starting," or "Did you bring me any?" Or "This would be better warmed up," or "There's dog shit on the rug." How often do we do that? That's not asking for anything, is it? That's just noticing. And what's happened though is, and I speak like that. And what happens is that Gretchen has learned one of the recovery principles. One of the recovery principles is to learn to say, "I don't care." And mean it. It's different than apathy. It's a bit different than apathy, but one of the most important words a codependent can learn is "I don't care." But even more than that, she's learned the ozone. The ozone, there's no ketchup on the table. Oh. Mom, you didn't iron my blouse. Oh. Mom, I was late for school because you didn't get me up. Oh. And that's part of recovery as well, the ozone and the "I don't care" zone. Notice how a lot of people, they get into their relationships and it's all of a sudden the big we. Everything is we. And I don't know if any of you have, I suppose some of you have had children. People do that still. And that, your husband's going around saying, "We're pregnant." Sure, we're pregnant, you SOB. I mean, or "We don't like parties." Hey, speak for yourself. I love parties or something. It's fun to watch couples do that, where the person is saying, we just, we just love to go skiing, and the other person hates skiing. You watch their face as the person saying this "we," and I finally decided that the person thinks they're the Pope. And that's just, it's always we. There's no real individual identity. It's we, the church, we, the family. And I really think that that's a reflection, and it becomes part of our rhetoric, how we talk about everybody else, as if it's me. There's also something about codependency. It's like, can one person sort of codependicize a relationship? That's a new term, by the way. Or infectious codependency. It's like, do you catch it from each other by hanging around codependence? And that, in a way, it seems like that's true. Because, of course, if you're living with a codependent, you learn to get careful about what you say, and how you say things, and what you do, and your behavior, and how you live up to yourself. And the more careful you get, of course, that's codependency, isn't it? But see, I think that that's also a little bit like thinking you catch codependency from an alcoholic. That they give you this codependency. And that's not really true. I mean, I think we really have to be trained for this stuff. And that's about childhood. And it's like, where do we learn that the relationship is more important than we are? You got to learn that in childhood. That doesn't happen just because you're in a relationship with a codependent. In fact, where do we lose the right to leave or insist on change? Those are childhood issues about learning to take care of yourself and learning to express your feelings. And if we don't have that learning to express our feelings and take care of ourselves, I think that we do get codependentized, but it's because of the family system. You see, you can have these problems in your childhood, but they don't show up until you get in a relationship with someone that has needs. And so what the person sort of brings out the system that's already there. But you can say, "Oh, hell, I was out 10 years before I ever got in this marriage, and I didn't have any problem with any of this stuff." True. See, but once you get into the relationship, you have a problem with it, but still not because of the person. They are just the vehicle by which the problem begins to express itself in our lives. But the problem has been there, and it's a part of our system. And so that codependency tendency to say, you know, like, well, I'm the codependent and you're the addict, you know, and that, you know, you're worse because you're the addict or something. You know, that doesn't really work. You know, our codependency isn't because they're the addict, and we're not going to get treated through their dealing with their addiction. I very seldom find anybody in a codependent relationship or relationship with an addict or that's losing themselves that wasn't trained for that in some way in their family.
This concludes tape number 1. The program is continued on tape number 2.
Addiction-free radio. You can talk with Jann in just a moment at area code 303-457-9952. If you're calling long distance, let the phone ring. We'll answer just as soon as we can put you on the air. Addiction-free radio is the only regularly scheduled talk show on the globe that we know of, broadcasting information for those suffering from an addiction. Jann will be back to answer your questions in just a moment. We are now taking phone calls at area code 303-457-9952. Jann will be back in just 2 minutes.
Honey, where's your paycheck? I need to pay the bills. Honey? Tom, you got paid today, didn't you?
Yeah, but there's no money left.
No money left? Again? The kids need new shoes, and what about the house payment? Tom, you've been drinking again, haven't you? Or is it cocaine this time? You promised me that you'd quit. You said you could do it on your own, that you didn't need any help. There's just no hope.
Don't give up. There is hope at Family Recovery Center. Family Recovery Center is the only hospital-based drug, alcohol, and codependency treatment facility in northern Colorado. Our specially trained and caring people will give you the help you've been hoping for. Call Family Recovery Center 24 hours a day, toll-free, at 1-800-322-HOPE. That's 1-800-322-4673. Let Family Recovery Center help you and your family live a life free from alcohol and other drugs.
Hello, this is Walter Cronkite, and I'd like to talk to you for a minute, especially if you're a parent of teenage children. Actually, I'm going to ask you to have a very difficult talk with your kids. No, I don't mean about teenage sex. For a lot of us, that would be easy compared with what I'm talking about. I mean drugs. I mean cocaine. I mean crack. Hard as it may be to talk about drugs with your kids, it should be unthinkable for you not to. After all, everyone knows it's a national problem, so your kids know that you know it, too. If you don't talk about it with them, if you don't fight it with them, your kids have every right to think you don't care. In fact, if you say nothing, it's practically like telling them it's okay. The idea of your kids using cocaine or crack ought to scare you to death. So, hard as it may be, you've got to learn about it, and you've got to talk about it.
This message brought to you by Communities for a Drug-Free Colorado.
Right now, I'd like to tell you about Indy Honda. They specialize in servicing and repairing Honda cars. Indy Honda will thoroughly check out your Honda car, tell you what needs to be done from the most important to the smallest detail, and you'll know your price options before any work is done. You'll be guaranteed expertise, integrity, and experience with your Honda car. They're located at Foothills Highway and Pearl, next to the Hyundai dealer in Boulder. Call Indy Honda at 442-8486.
Preventing teenage pregnancy is important to families today. TAP Aware is a program that provides prevention workshops for preteens, teens, and their families. TAP Aware also provides services and training for both pregnant teens and parent teens. The TAP Aware organization is located in the Eastside Health Center. You can help teens and the TAP Aware program by donating articles such as baby clothing, blankets, and equipment. Call 399-0603 for further information.
You are with Jan Scott here this evening on Addiction Free Radio. Just about concludes another evening. You were listening to Terry Kellogg on his series on codependency. Interesting guy. He was actually a missionary in the South Seas. You believe that? Did he sound like a missionary to you? We get pretty far out here on Addiction Free Radio sometimes. Further out than I'd like to get. Tomorrow, we will be on at 10 o'clock in the morning, and Sunday night we will be back on at 7, and we'll be playing the rebroadcasts of the best of Addiction Free Radio. So that's tomorrow at 10 and Sunday night at 7 o'clock. This is Jan Scott saying good night and God bless you.
You've been listening to Addiction Free Radio with your host, Jann Scott. Jann invites you to join him every night at 7 on most of these same stations. If you would like a cassette copy of tonight's show, send $3 check or money order in American currency to Jann Scott, Addiction Free Radio, Post Office Box 545, Lyons, Colorado, 80540, USA. That's Box 545, Lyons, Colorado, 80540, USA. Jann also welcomes any ideas or suggestions you might have. If you know someone who needs this radio show, even though they don't know they need it, tune in with them any night at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, right here on the Addiction Free Radio Network.
Eight o'clock here at 76 KJIM Thornton, Denver. Good evening to you. Mike Ray here with you, bringing you the music that you want to hear. Let's start it off. This is brand new from Billy Sprague. This is from the album La Vie. This is called Someone Is There.
Open